Welcome to Spiritual Studies Session 18. After a long wait, I'm happy to be back. Today is on the ether. Anything and everything about the ether. This whole talk, in its summation, will give you a full understanding of ether. There are many leads that I'm going to give out that you can investigate further, but we are going to cover the Greek understanding, the ancient understanding, the Indian understanding, the Hindu understanding by that, and of course the scientific. At this beginning, we're going to start with a lot of etymology, and this is just going to set the playing board. This is going to help us put things together later. So if it seems a bit scrambled, know that there is a method. So first we start with the etymology of ether. This from Old French, simply meaning the upper regions of space. This is coming directly from Latin, which here in Latin, it's A-E-T-H-E-R. So when you see two different spellings, ether and aether, they're the same word, just different heritages. From Latin, it meant the upper pure bright air, the sky, or the firmament. So right away, we have this association with air up there. Then we move to the Greek. And in the Greek understanding, the etymology of ether, it is the, yet again, upper air, bright, pure air, the sky. So the Latins didn't change it much. However, we also see this association in Greek that gives ether the connotation of burning, to incinerate. So not only are we talking about the element air here, but now we're implicating the element of fire in the etymology of ether. So in ancient cosmology, there was a element that was thought to fill all of space beyond the sphere of the moon, and all the planets essentially were within this element, ether, space, air. So thought of as a purer air, or as a fire, or just some kind of mystical fifth element. So as of the 17th century, all the way to the 19th, that's when you'd start to see the word ether be used in a scientific standard. This was a frame of reference. Again, it was in the same respect to think of the substance of space, and we'll go over the science end of this much more later, but it was also used to designate a volatile chemical, which it's still used for in chemistry to this day. A substance that lacks color, or has a quality of lightness to it. So on the other note, before I move on about this etymology, the Greeks thought of ether as not only what fills space, but also was the essence or the air that the gods breathed. So there's this, again, mystical added element to things. So our air is lesser air, and then there's the air of the gods. And again, we're talking Greeks here, so the planets are the gods, right? Direct embodiments of the gods. So here we have that implication. Now, when we're talking about the Greek understanding of the word to incinerate, or to burn, or to shine, This is also a reference to Prometheus stealing the fire or the air of the gods for mortals. So aside from all of this kind of mystical cosmic interpretation, we also have to consider that ether moves to different words, even down to Ethernet cables. That's because in the 18th century, they were referring to radio as ether. So anything that was invisible had this trademark term ether. So thus we adopted the Ethernet. Also, the word esters also comes from ethers, which means smells. Esters are what they call smells that come off of wine, chemical compositions that produce scent. Again, something invisible, immediately associated with a trademark term that they'll wrap onto everything, ether. Okay, so to move away from that for a bit, then we have to talk about what is really tied to the word, completely tied to the word, and that's this word quintessence. So this is what the alchemists were seeking, was this quintessence pre-chemistry. The quinta, 5, essentia, essence, beingness. So the search for the 5th element. Later on, this would be understood as meaning perfection. If you say that's the quintessence of something, it's the perfection of something. That's jumping off of just what I mentioned, this seeking of this 5th element, the originator of all other elements, the quintessence, quintensia. So this whole act of alchemy was to sort through all these elements, water, earth, fire, air, to distillate this hypothesized ether that they were seeking, quintessence. So they're literally the same thing. Now I have to kind of jump off a bit. It seems like I'm going off the rails here, but we have to talk about the etymology of the word spirit. And spirit is actually really obvious for us to dissect. It's spiritus, or we find it in the word respiration. So to breathe is to respirate, spiritus. Inspiration is to take in a breath of life. So spirit in this way is also a elemental reference. It's a reference to the wind. It's a reference to air. So the spirit is in the air, or it is the air. So you can see, again, if we're talking about ether being air, spirit is involved in this equation. It only would later in the 14th and 16th centuries mean something that we think of it as now, like ghosts, apparitions. This is a later understanding of what is meant by spirit. If you go talk to a shaman, this is not what they mean by spirit, how we interpret this word now. And of course, in alchemy too, spirit would change its name into alcohol, that it imbibed, that something is imbibed with spirits. Spirits in this same way was volatile substance. Something that had a lot of life in it, or a lot of spirit, was a very volatile, potentially explosive substance. So you can see how these two go hand in hand. Ether, quintessence, and spirit. Only until the 1600s did that become ubiquitous with alcohol, which alcohol, by the way, comes from an Aramaic root that ties it to the same thing. They tied it more to demons, but that's a whole nother subject. So soul is the last one that I have to mention on this. And soul is different because I've been talking about Greek and Latin this whole time, but this is actually Old English, Proto-Germanic, Seol. And this Seol, as we define it now, would be an entity believed to be inside of every person, something that feels, thinks, and wills. That is the dictionary definition of soul. The spiritual and emotional part of a person. If we take it older, then it meant the animating existence of life itself. The soul is what makes gross material alive. If something is alive, then it has a soul. Otherwise, it would just effectively be garbage. It would not function. But to bring it back to Seol, as I was mentioning, the idea is that this word is in regards to the sea. It's coming from or belonging to the sea, water in itself. Now, the implication here and why I mention it is because the cosmos, the planets, were by the ancient conception an ocean of themselves. That when they're saying of the sea, you might think that we're referring to a sea, our sea, an ocean, the Atlantic, the Pacific. However, this is tied to, again, a more cosmic understanding. So something that belongs to the cosmos or the sea. And lastly, to give more context, the firmament. You see this referenced in the Bible a lot. And in my first etymology of ether, there's the mention of it being the firmament. And the firmament just means firm, firm. It's the foundation. It's what is strong and enduring. So the ancient conception would be one of two things: the foundation of material itself, so the foundation of all material existence, or the firmament literally being the cusp or the membrane around the earth that divides it from everything else outside of it. So in this way, it means the expanse. So there's our classic etymology. As I've been setting, these things are all tied together. We'll dissect that more later. But now we need to learn a different word. We're familiar with it, but something to learn. It's Akasha. This is the Hindi equivalent of ether. So this is Sanskrit. And Akasha is defined loosely as open space or sky or atmosphere. You see, this is the same. A technical definition would be the ethereal fluid imagined as pervading the cosmos. So the everything, really, the everything, the Akasha. A different sect or denomination of Hinduism, the Vedantic Hinduism, would distinguish this as the essence of all material things. The first element created, the first element that brought forth all other elements. It is designated as all-pervading, eternal, and the one physical substance which is imperceptible. So you can see how tricky this job of defining ether and Akasha is. All of this is very ambiguous. Akasha might be recognizable to any of you because this is the root of the term Akashic records, which is tied to the New Age quite a bit, theosophy. If you look into Hinduism or yogis, it is the records or the database or the download that one can receive of all information that the universe has ever known. The Akashic records, which the Akasha would know everything, being that it is participating in all things, is the foundation of all things. So instead of me just talking about words, now we can actually start getting into the more nitty-gritty aspect. So when it comes to the Greeks, you have Plato, you have Aristotle, and you have all the pre-Socratics and Pythagoreans mentioning the ether in different ways. Now, Plato would distinguish it as the most translucent kind of element, or the most translucent kind of air, of which would actually be referred to as ether, and that fire has sometimes been mistaken for ether. Now, I want to take a moment here. So Plato's tying it to ether. The definition in Greek ties ether to fire. So when we look at the Old Testament or Enoch, in Ezekiel or in Enoch, whenever they're mentioning their mystical travels, their seeing God and the angelic hierarchy and cherubim and all this, they're always mentioning fire. So let's just take note of that right now, because it comes tied into later. Now, in the book On the Heavens, Plato noted that all four terrestrial elements move in a linear fashion. They do causal and effect phenomena, whereas he says the first element, the ether, is non-locale, and it moves in circular methods. It's not linear, and he distinguishes it as neither hot nor cold, not wet nor dry. So paradoxical. Now, when it comes to Aristotle, he's the one that would really give a lot of the ideas that alchemists would grab onto later, after the church had suppressed so much and the Renaissance brought alchemy back out in Hermeticism. Of course, he's noting a lot of the same thing as Plato does. He doesn't differ with him in these ways. He says that the ether naturally moves in circles. It has no contrary. It has no unnatural motion or any motion whatsoever, really. All the stars and the planets are etheric. The gods breathe the ether. When you're observing the orbits of the stars and planets, they're all in a perfectly circular motion. And to him, this means that it's all etheric. If it's all in a perfectly spherical form, or it moves in a perfectly spherical fashion, it's an etheric phenomenon. Ooh. So, only later on do we start to see alchemists, people hypothesizing about what this is and bringing more of an occult end to things. Now, in some of these definitions about ether being non-locale, non-perceptible, this is likened to what scientists now irrefutably don't know how to explain, which is dark energy. And it's conceptually like how they describe ether. It's not a particle. It's a smooth thing that fills space. And it doesn't appear to be moving in any sort of way. It just takes up space. And if you were to shine a light on dark matter, dark energy, you can't see it. So that's one end of tying it to the science-y. Now, when this is where I'm going to have to start diving into all the physics when it comes to this, because there's a big story of physics here. So we're really participating in the real world now instead of the mystical. The physicists called it the luminiferous ether, which means light-bearing ether. So the idea right away that I have to set up, as physicists were interested in this, Isaac Newton and the sort, all those that came after Copernicus, because if light is a wave, that means that it's traveling through a medium. If you look at sound, the wave has the medium as the air. So in which case, there must be a medium for light, thus luminiferous ether. So this was completely accepted until the work of Michelson and Morley, which in 1887 set out to prove the ether, but as it's been said, this disproved the ether. They couldn't measure the ether. So thus, game's off, boys. It's something else. Space is a vacuum. So here's the untold story, though. This guy's name is Dayton Miller. And in order to measure the ether, Michelson and Morley built this, what is called a light beam interferometer. And Dayton Miller just decided to reproduce the experiment, but with more sensitive machinery. As scientists should do, they shouldn't point to one experiment and say, this is conclusive. So Dayton Miller who, mind you, is someone who's completely unbiased. If you actually go through his work, you see he's actually very methodical and unleaning when it comes to this. He built a more sensitive interferometer and tried that machine much, much more. So he started doing this in 1902 to 1906, and then he would continue to add on to the sensitivity of this machine, and continued later on years from 1921 to 1928, and then added more sensitivity to this machine. And in 1933, he puts out a paper showing all of his work. He had a total of over 200,000 individual readings, and he turned this machine 12,000 times, versus Michelson and Morey had their machine for only 6 hours. That's how many times or how long they did it. They did it over the span of a week in 1887, and they did 36 turns. So you can see how minute the Michelson and Morey experiment is in comparison to Dayton Miller's collective research. And over again, Dayton Miller is putting out this stuff. However, the difference here is that no matter what he could prove on paper, he was competing with a new, more popular idea, which was all being propounded by Einstein, right? So, sorry, but I gotta kind of paint Einstein in a bad light here. So, Einstein had his model of general or relativity, and was only gaining popularity, especially after this point, because of everything that was going on with nuclear physics. So, as a quote from Albert Einstein himself, and I quote, "I believe that I have really found the relationship between gravitation and electricity, assuming that the Miller experiments are based on a fundamental error. Otherwise, the whole relativity theory collapses like a house of cards." So, it's not hard to say that it was very advantageous to make sure that what Dayton Miller was saying about the ether, calculating the ether, measuring the ether, would be shut up very quickly, because not only did you have the popularity of Einstein, but you had all of his yay-sayers all around. And it's much better to proceed with a model of understanding instead of accepting the unknown, right? And physics has been guilty of this ever since its scientific conception, of always believing it's on the cusp of figuring everything out, having a theory of everything. Now, um, I don't want to jump too far ahead right here too, because this whole story of the luminiferous ether isn't this late in the game. You had Nikola Tesla. He frequently would accredit what he did to ether. Ether is the medium for which every electromagnetic wave, from radio waves to gamma rays, participates. That's a direct quote from Tesla. When Tesla was removing light bulbs from the energy source and going far away and showing there's no batteries or anything, he was saying that the energy is coming from the ether. Now, gosh, I'm not going to get too heavy into that, but when you read these stories, because they show you about this in history class, when it comes to Edison screwing over Tesla, Edison was the popular guy, Tesla was the one that was right. But Edison wins the day because he's the more popular one, he's got more money, and he's more acceptable in the main fold of things. Now, Tesla especially was a bad character, because if you could have free energy, that was bad news for oil, right? So good to shuffle that under the curtains real quick. So you have two of the same story here, Einstein and Dayton Miller, and you have Edison and Tesla. We're talking about a suppressed understanding, a suppressed technology that has been known of for the last, 100 years, but has just been kept under wraps. classified style. Now, in modern times, if we're talking about modern physicists, um, I'm going to quote this guy, Robert B. Langland. He's Nobel laureate in physics, uh, theoretical physics. He says, the word ether has an extremely negative connotation in theoretical physics because of its past association with opposition to relativity. Let me jump ahead. I don't want to read this whole thing. If you strip it of these connotations, it rather nicely captures the way that most physicists actually think about the vacuum, in quotes. Essentially, what he's saying is if you're looking at the cosmos especially on a quantum level, there's always something there. There is no vacuum. You'll always find quantum solids and fluids. There's never emptiness. So in which case, it is a medium for light to travel through. And they witness this more and more with their large particle accelerators. So as quantum physics is going on, it's starting to unravel what has already been suppressed. So that's the physics end of things. So let's jump back to all the heady stuff, okay? So in mentioning theosophy, in mentioning Hinduism, you're talking about this belief of the devas, or their gods, existing in planetary forms and breathing ether. Again, we're tying the Greek to the Hindus here. This isn't a fluke understanding by an ancient idiotic culture. This is a general truth that deserves to be unraveled. So in talking on the devas, the planetary stars, planets, they would say these devas help guide the operation and processes of nature itself, the growth of plants, and their appearance is like colored flames. So again, tying it to fire, incineration, or again, like I mentioned in the book of Enoch, in Ezekiel, how the Bible ties to this too. Experiencing the devas, experiencing the angels, experiencing God, this phenomena or interpretation of fire. When the third eye is activated, which take this for what you will, these devas can be observed in their either in their incarnated form or their fiery form. And this, to the theosophists, the etheric realm, okay, so let's back this up a bit. The etheric realm would be subtle energy, very subtle energy, so subtle that it's outside of our sensory perception. So if we can only see a fraction of visible light, but then you have gamma rays, you have microwaves, right? This is so minute that it's something that we would never see even with our most sophisticated technologies, unless, like the Hindus or the Theosophists say, with your third eye. And this is the realm of what all these old myths are participating in. The elementals, meaning like gnomes, fairies, dwarfs, elves, they exist by the theosophical understanding. They exist in the etheric dimension, in the etheric wavelength. And so they're always here, but they're not perceptible, being, again, a matter of our own threshold. So this is bringing up a different fold. Subtle energy, and also the mention of other dimensionality existing simultaneous with our own. So it's not just a matter of what's out there, right? And so there's this distinguishing of your etheric body, which is one thing. I'm not going to get into multidimensional humanism right now, but this distinction of etheric matter and other matter, a matter that is simultaneous with physical matter, or what they call gross matter. Now, I don't like to bring this up because at some point I want to give a full talk on it, but I've mentioned it a few times in the course, and it's the Kabbalah. And I don't like to mention it because you have so much detail to go into with each and every one thing mentioned. But the Kabbalah is relevant here. This is Jewish mysticism. This is the Jewish hidden kind of knowledge. This is what is at the actual root of what the rabbis look into. There's the esoteric knowledge of what people think Judaism is, but then there's the esoteric knowledge, and that is Kabbalah. Now, in Kabbalah, in the Tree of Life, the very top of the hierarchy, the very top of the Tree of Life is what they call keter, K-E-T-E-R. Take away the K, Ether, ether. In defining what keter is, it's effectively the Godhead, for one. But although it contains all potential for everything, it itself has no content, and therefore is called a nothing, or the hidden light, or the air that cannot be grasped. Keter is subliminal. It is sublime. It is the most hidden of all hidden things, and is defined as incomprehensible to man. That's why they don't speak the word of God, because to speak the word is to categorize it, is to rip it down, is to underwhelm it. Keter is also understood to be invisible and colorless. So in their like substitute word for God, they would say Eya Asher Eya, which has this association with the burning bush. Burning with what? Burning with fire, burning with ether, burning with keter. And that this word means coming from the source, which is the infinite. So in reference to the burning bush, the fires are coming from Eya Asher Eya. You can see why I don't like to dive too much into this also, because, you know, keter as well is defined as pure consciousness, beyond all categories and timeless. So what am I supposed to do here? How am I supposed to distinguish this, right? In Hinduism and in yoga, this is understood to be your crown. Keter is your crown chakra, and of which they usually subscribe the color white. But in that, even in that definition, isn't going for how they're actually trying to, how they understand what Keter or the crown chakra is. It's not nothingness. It's a great somethingness, but it's riddled with paradoxical understanding. It's always in the effect of subtlety. It's never in the effect of concrete, jarring phenomena. So this observing of crown chakra energy or keter is always in the most hypnagogic, subliminal, blissed out trance states that one could ever hope to achieve through meditation, through sacred medicine, what have you. So, this great somethingness, this keter, this timelessness, this pure consciousness, you could say, so if we're applying this to the scientific, that the medium of light's travel is pure consciousness. Now I'm going to back up a little bit here. Spinoza is an old philosopher that preached radical subjectivity. He said that once you don't see something, it goes away. It's the classic, if the tree falls in the forest, did it actually fall argument. If a person is observing a phenomena, it exists. But if they're not observing it, it doesn't exist. As if the universe would cease to be if there were no eyes to see. So this idea of Spinoza ran into the trick. Well, okay, if nobody's there, then how does it seem as though something is always there, even if it's not being seen? And the way he explained it was God, right? Classic philosophical, like backfall, God. But really, it was this ether that The ether is pure consciousness. The ether is always all seeing because the ether is involved in all things. This will become relevant later. So, whew, whew. We have to think back on what was mentioned before, these ancient conceptions of space as the sea, as the ocean. Ether would be the water of this ocean. If we are in an ocean, it is invisible to us. You don't ask a fish about what the water is. So it's invisible to all the creatures in the sea, but it's their everything. It's everywhere. It is them. It's all around them. They breathe it. They need it. And notice too that from the atomic to the cosmic level, whether we're talking macroscopic or microscopic, all structures have a same or similar fundamental design. You look at a proton and electrons rotating around it. Well, look at the sun and look at the planets, right? This same fundamental structure playing itself out on different scales. The only difference is the level of complexity in each structure. So this uniformity is tied to this understanding of keter, of ether, of akasha. Now I want to give another word. I said I was done with etymology, but it's a Greek word that ether took all the limelight from, and it's Apeiron, and it means that which is unlimited, indefinite, infinite, boundless. So literally Apeiron, a meaning no, perier meaning limit, no boundary, no end. So Apeiron was said to be the origin of all things because it's indefinite. So this is where we're digging into and better understanding through this concept of ether and everything, the Greek beginning story, creation story, the cosmogony. So the old philosopher is Anaximander. He was a pre-Socratic, so before Socrates. And he, if you know anything about the pre-Socratics, what their thing was is they were all offering these different ideas for what the universe is made out of. What's it made out of? What is this? And some were saying it's water, and some, some were saying it's fire. Heraclitus, I think, right? But no, Anaximander said that it's this Apeiron. And he said that this Apeiron, this boundlessness, is subject to neither old age nor decay. It perpetually yields fresh materials from everything, of which everything is derived from it. And that Apeiron is neither hot nor cold, nor wet nor dry. And again, all creation stems from it. So, to bring back that little thing that I mentioned about the book of Enoch and Ezekiel, again, we're saying that this ether, this Apeiron, is hot and cold, simultaneous, okay? So here's a quote from the book of Enoch real quick. This is when he's like tripping. This is when he's traveling through the cosmos, witnessing heaven and all this. He says, "And I entered into that house, and it was as hot as fire and as cold as ice. There were no delights of life therein." So there's that. Then we look at Ezekiel. So this is canon to the Bible. It says, "And I looked at a lofty throne." This is again when he's seeing God and the cherubim, "which had the appearance of ice, and its wheels shone like the sun. And from beneath the throne issued rivers of flaming fire, and I was unable to see." Apeiron, Apeiron, Apeiron. So everything is generated from Apeiron, eternity, boundlessness. Everything that is destroyed will go back to Apeiron. And he believed that infinite worlds are created from Apeiron, and infinite worlds will be destroyed and return to it. Ooh. By the way, this is the whole, this point of history is where we're getting the idea of atoms to begin with in the first place. Atomism came from the pre-Socratics. So this is when they're figuring all this stuff out or referencing what we're going to be digging up now, right? So to bring up quantum mechanics again, Heisenberg states that all quantum states derive from a primordial substance. So even now, we're saying the same thing, but with just different words. This primordial substance is what the alchemist called the prima materia, or what they were searching for with the quintessence, or, you know, the search for the spirit, the search for the soul. So Heisenberg's associate, Max Born, actually called this prima materia the substance Apeiron. It's a joke, man. It's all that, it's all right there to see. This prima materia, this originating substance, was chaos. That's what they define as chaos when you're translating the old Greek stories about the beginning of the cosmos. That which was before the gods, that which was before the planets, the stars, the sun, was chaos, the void, the cosmic waters, the celestial sea, the ether, Akasha, prima materia, the philosopher's stone, and the Tao. So this is what I haven't mentioned this whole time, is this is also Taoism. Everything that I'm talking to you about right now, all of this is Taoism. The Tao is defined by Lao Tzu as that which provides for all things, but doesn't lordeth over them. He attributes, if you want to take your own interpretation to this, it is the divine feminine, the thing that provides the foundation that gives everything a means to exist, the rules, the very fabric, the fundamental nature of things is the Tao. And so when you see that the Tao has the little black eye and the little white eye and then the crossed colors, this contrast, hot and cold, wet and dry, it's all the Tao. It's all the yin yang. It's all the same ether stuff. So it's not, the confusion of me trying to address this isn't in what it is. It's all the different ways that cultures have come to illustrate it. They're all talking about the same thing, and we have multiple names for it now. So the note on alchemy here is that you could say that that they were seeking the Tao. They were seeking, strangely enough, and what I have to mention too is people think alchemists were all about brewing up this physical thing, like they could physically brew up a scrap of the prima materia, but that's not necessarily accurate to what they were really doing. Their intention was to embody the prima materia, to become the prima materia. So we think of now in our materialistic understanding of the world that it was always this search for something physical. However, the alchemical process wasn't just a process of heating things up and adding different chemicals to this and that. It was synonymous with the journey of the partitioner, or the one participating, their own mental state, their own growth, their transmutation of their own perception of reality. And the idea of reaching the philosopher's stone was to get full woke, was to understand the all, was to reach a complete holistic understanding of everything, and to become enlightened. So whew, the note here as well that ether and Akasha could also be understood as what I was referencing at the beginning as the life force, the anima, or the noumena, this aspect that makes material existence alive. That's one way that this word has been used in the past. Another way that we could understand the ether is to call it consciousness. And in this way, the whole game of the universe, the whole game of everything, is to achieve consciousness. Everything to become conscious. Everything to imbibe the ethereal. So in this way, anything that could be seen is something that involves the ether. I know that one's kind of a lot to wrap your head around. The ether can also be understood as the field, the plane, and this is like mathematics and physics when I say it this way. What is the canvas? We're not talking about what we could see. We're not talking about the brush stroke. We're not talking about the planet. We're not talking about the star. What is the field? What is the black canvas that is always behind all things? This is the ether. It is the potentiation or the eternity or the boundlessness, right? And like I mentioned, we could also define the ether as the Tao. And if you want to understand truly what the ether is, then you should turn monastic. Then you should take inward journeys and contemplate on the life and death involving all things, how things come into existence, how things go out of existence, how a tree falls over and dies, yet provides life to everything that blooms out of it. This is the Tao, this is the ether, it's the ever-continuing story, all potentiality, and not being biased, and knowing that you don't know anything, and that the Tao, as the Taoists and the Eastern, what should we call that? Eastern thinkers think of it as, is that the Tao isn't necessarily the substance, and it's not necessarily a philosophy, but it's the way. And what they mean by the way is it's the real way, the way to live, the way to be, the intuition that people feel, the things that they know that they should do. And non-judgment on all things, because it's knowing that all things are subject to potentiality. So to step out of that a little bit, we could also say, in defining the ether, that it's the invisible. So how tricky is that? It's everything that you don't see. And all the things that you see, it's all the things that you don't see. That's the ether. That is the upper air. If all these things are visible, that necessitates that things are invisible. So since that things are invisible, that's it. And in this way too, it's the incorporeal. And incorporeal just means corporeal, corpse, body. Incorporeal meaning not bodied, unembodied, something without a body. So what were you before you were born? What happened to 2019? Where is it? This is the incorporeal, something that has no form, something that has no way of it for it to be expressed. So the ether in this way is something that cannot be embodied. It is something that is beyond expression. It is the thing that we look at to get what we want out of the universe. So if you have a whole spectrum, what we do is we take a little pinprick and then we decide this is everything. This is all of it. We took a hair from it. And what it is all the things that are left unthought of, all the things that are left unsaid, all the feelings that could be felt. This is the incorporeal. And another way for me to define, and mind you, I don't have endless definitions, although that would be fitting for this. The other way to define the ether, the quintessence, the Akasha, is the extra dimensional. It's what is outside of our sensory perception. It's us having to admit the unknown, that there are things beyond our comprehension. that there are potentially places on different vibrations, or hopefully different existences. If you want to take it more literally, different universes, different dimensions, the extra dimensional. This is the ether. Satisfied? The one thing that I want to tease at here is the phenomena of phenomenology. That's what the ether is. And what I mean by that is consciousness, existence. The feeling that you've ever looked at your hand and kind of creeped yourself out, like, this is weird. Or your toes. My toes freak me out sometimes. If you ever get this existential feeling, like getting hit in the face with the absurdity of existence itself, this is the phenomena of phenomenology. This is a experientialization of the ether. This is the field. So we're living life very convinced of our ways, very convinced that we're doing X, Y, and Z for such and such reason, or I'm on my way to do this. We're very convinced of the seriousness of whatever predicament we've fooled ourselves into. The ether is when we forget that, is when we drop all that. This is the phenomena. It's happening. Ooh. You don't define it. You don't categorize it. You don't give reasons. If you're just playing, you have nothing to play for. You're not thinking of anything. You're not thinking about, you don't even know your own name. If you're just doing, and you're just feeling things out, you can make friends with a rock, and you just embrace that full, what we call childishness. This is the phenomena. This is the Tao. That's what the Tao is, the way. And this is the ether. And lastly, I know I could have went on a lot more in some categories, but this is my closing card. Lastly, to define the ether, outside of all the physics, outside of all of the lore and religiosity and the spirituality, the theosophists, the Greeks, so on, the ether is boundlessness. We can guess, we can try to categorize it as physicists always would. If we want to pay that type of mind, then there is always the subtle energy, the things that escape our radars, the very minute energy that pervades all existence, whether we like it or not. This is one way that we can pigeonhole the ether. And we could harness it for tremendous opportunity. Tesla did, allegedly, right? But if we wanted to be very plain and simple, this ether is boundlessness. It is the unknown. It's hinting at the fact that we don't know. It's hinting at the fact that our conceptions, our models of approach require reassessment. And culturally, we've been very tight-lipped and very graspy of our ideas of approaching the world. And we're very egotistical in how right we are. Science has got it. And this ether, whether mystically, physically, historically, pre-cosmogenically, is the kind of elephant in the room. It's kind of comical, actually. Okay, I'm going to end it there.